Hey everyone, I'm Allison Morris. You're watching NBC News Now. We begin with the deadly shooting spree in Georgia. 8 people were killed in 3 separate spas in the Atlanta area last night. 6 of those victims, Asian women. The alleged gunman, 21-year-old Robert Long, now in custody and taking responsibility for all 3 shootings, telling investigators he was motivated by a sex addiction, not by race. Cherokee County Sheriff saying it is too early to call this a hate crime.
It's still early, but the indicators right now are it may not be. It may be targets of opportunity. Again, we believe that he frequented these places in the past and may have been lashing out.
President Biden briefed on the Atlanta shootings, addressing the fear in the Asian community.
I've been speaking about the brutality against Asian Americans for the last couple months, and I think it is very, very troubling. But I'm making no connection at this moment to the motivation of the killer. I'm waiting for an answer as the investigation proceeds, from the FBI and from the Justice Department.
Let's get right to NBC News correspondent Kathy Park in Atlanta. We also have Cedric Alexander, the former police chief of DeKalb County, Georgia. He was also a member of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. Kathy, to you first. What else have you learned from investigators there today?
Allison, well, I will start with a little bit more on the suspect. We heard from officials earlier this morning, and they were saying that he confessed to the crimes, but did tell authorities that this was not racially motivated. In fact, he said he had some sort of sexual addiction and was lashing out at these businesses. And that's what he said prompted him to attack these 3 spas across the greater Atlanta area. We are in front of one of the spas right now. There is another one across the street where more victims were gunned down. And then about 45 minutes away from where we are now in Cherokee County, 4 people were killed at a separate spa there. So in total, 8 victims, 1 person was injured, and as you mentioned earlier, 6 of the victims were of Asian descent. Obviously, this has rattled the Asian American community because over the past year, there has been a spike in anti-Asian incidents across the country. And here in Atlanta, officials say that they have upped their resources and say that it will be available to any of the businesses tied to the Asian community. They are able to assist if they feel they need that sort of help. But also in New York, they have also upped their support as well in the wake of this violence. Allison?
Cedric, when this news first broke, we were all wondering if this was a hate crime targeted at Asian Americans, given the 3,800 plus Asian hate crimes reported in the U.S. since the start of this pandemic, and also that 6 of the 8 victims here were Asian women. Police, though, saying now they have a man in custody who appears to be cooperating, answering their questions, telling them this was about eliminating a temptation. If you were running this investigation, what kinds of questions would you be asking? What would you be focusing on right now?
Well, certainly one thing that would be clearly important for us to do, Allison, is to, any witnesses and, of course, any surviving witnesses. I hear it now. Can you hear me?
Keep going, Cedric. Sorry, I think we're having a little technical issue with Kathy's shot, but please continue.
Yeah. So to answer your question, this is, of course, is an ongoing investigation. There are going to be a lot of questions that's going to be asked of surviving victims and, of course, any witnesses as well, too, that were on the scene. It is important to certainly take into account what you heard the Sheriff's Department say there from Cherokee County. It appeared not to be a hate crime, but it is still very early in this investigation. And also, to your point, in this space and time we're living in right now where we had over 3,800 reported cases of Asian Americans in this country who have reported incidents or attacks. That's probably not even a real number. The real number is probably going to be much more than that. But of course, oftentimes we know many crimes and incidents are not reported. So we just have to continue on with this investigation and they will be able to, of course, have an opportunity to interview other witnesses who may have a different account.
Cedric, let me ask you this. 7 of the 8 people who were killed were women. Frank Figluzzi, a former assistant director for FBI counterintelligence, was on MSNBC this morning. Listen to his take, and I'll ask you a question on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Focused on ethnicity, but let's not miss the point that gender will be a major role here. His victims were, by and large, women. And so if his wrath is women, if he's trying to eliminate that which tempts him in his addiction, and it's early for us to get our hands around this whole thing, then it's possible that a gender could be a protected class that might apply to a state or federal hate crime as well.
So, Cedric, how do investigators go about determining whether this was a hate crime against women or Asian Americans or even both here?
Well, I think we have to take into account this. The data certainly do show, even out of those 3,800 attacks that have been reported, a large majority of those have been women victims. Now, there could be another reason for that. For an example, bullies are usually the ones who are making these assaults, either passively or aggressively. They're usually bullies. They usually pick on women, and because they may see them as being more of a victim and easier to intimidate. But I think there's a psychological piece to this as well, what your other guest was alluding to, and that is whatever his fetish was around these sexual temptations that have sent him to these shops. I think there is something seriously going on with him mentally, and that certainly is going to have to be explored. But in terms of what the federal statute may state, that will be certain. That will be something I'm quite sure your local DA offices and your federal U.S. attorney offices will take a look at as well.
Kathy, if you're able to hear us now, sorry, I think we had a bad connection to you there. But sorry, we don't have Kathy. Cedric, I have one more question for you then. However, these crimes in Atlanta are classified, whatever happens here, as we've been saying, hate incidents against Asian Americans are a huge problem in our country right now. What would you like to see law enforcement doing to better protect our Asian community, to make people feel safe in their own homes, their own neighborhoods, if perhaps they don't right now?
Well, certainly what a lot of agencies are doing across the community, large and small, and that is reaching out to their local Asian communities, making sure that they have an opportunity for open communication and dialogue. They're adding patrols in some cities to Asian communities, but also we have to keep in mind that all of us as Americans have a responsibility to look out and take care of each other, because this certainly is a population, and the data and statistics support it, that they have been up under attack, particularly over the last year in this pandemic environment. So I would be encouraging everyone, all of us, along with local law enforcement, which I'm quite sure are already ahead of this, is that we all have to be eyes and ears and look out for each other in this very challenging time we're in.
Yeah, it certainly is a challenging time, and we are so deeply concerned for the Asian Americans in this country who are victims of these crimes. Cedric, thank you so much for being with us today and dealing with our technical difficulties. We appreciate it.
That's okay. All right. Thank you.
The NYPD not taking any chances, sending officers to Asian communities across New York City after the fatal shootings in Atlanta. Hate crimes against New York's Asian American community up 800% in 2020, according to the NYPD. NBC News investigative correspondent Vicky Nguyen joins me now. Vicky, you've been covering the increase in Asian American hate crimes. What have you learned about what is behind them?
Good afternoon, Allison. I really appreciate what your guest Cedric just had to say about how we all have to be the eyes and ears for each other and really come together in this time, whether it's law enforcement, community, neighbors, all of the above. what we are learning is a lot of things are behind these attacks. Sometimes it's ignorance, sometimes it's mental health, and sometimes it's just plain old racism. Some of my sources in law enforcement have said that they worry that reporting on this may contribute to copycat crimes in a small way. One person put it like this: you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. He thinks it's super important that we put a spotlight on this and talk about this and bring it into the public awareness. And he believes that a small fraction of these crimes may be triggering others. But at the end of the day, people need to be vigilant. They need to know what's going on so they can protect themselves.
Yeah, Vicki, that is such an interesting problem you bring up, because you certainly want people to be aware of what's going on, but you don't want to encourage more of this awful behavior and violence. Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms called the spa shootings, a crime against us all. Here she is this morning.
Obviously, whatever the motivation was for this guy, we know that many of the victims, the majority of the victims, were Asian. We also know that this is an issue that's happening across the country. It is unacceptable, it is hateful, and it has to stop.
So, Vicki, what needs to happen to turn those words into actions? How can we be allies to Asian Americans in this country, to be supportive, to help get this to stop?
It really starts with leadership like that, words like that, because words do matter to help people feel like they are being seen, that they are being heard. She also said we're not victim shaming or victim blaming. I think that really resonated with a lot of people on social media as well. Just letting the Asian American community know that they are not alone and that people are joining in and offering support. As allies, you know, we just did an interview with clinical psychologist Jenny Wang. She runs an Instagram called Asians for Mental Health, and she's been providing so much great practical guidance for folks over the past year on how to cope with this. But she said for allies, it's really important to just say, look, I'm here for you. I'm educating myself. I see what's happening. I hear what's happening. And if you need me, let me know what I can do. I think just offering that helps people to feel like it's there, right? And so it starts with that. And also she talked about coalition building, you know, and educating yourself about the history of relationships between cultures. She specifically mentioned Black and Asian cultures and the history we have of supporting one another. And so it's looking for that, keeping your faith and looking for the things that unite, and also stepping away sometimes, unplugging from social media to give yourself time to heal, and remembering that racism didn't start overnight and this anti-Asian sentiment didn't start overnight. It won't be solved overnight. So we all have to pace ourselves and do what we feel like we can, Allison.
Vicki, the numbers here are really scary. 68% of Asian American hate incidents happen to women, just 29% to men. These numbers, of course, according to Stop AAPI Hate. I mean, the vast majority of those incidents were verbal harassment, but 11% of them were physical assaults. Again, really startling numbers. How can we better protect particularly Asian American women who are largely the victims of these crimes, which are sometimes physical?
Yeah, women and our elders. I mean, there was a spate of attacks on elders that have been captured since the beginning of this year that I really think helped catalyze this national conversation that we are having. First, though, what I want to say is, you know, the focus shouldn't just be on women and elders having to defend themselves. It really needs to be a conversation about the perpetrators, the attackers, and stop it. You know, people need to talk about society and how this violence is not acceptable, you know, first and foremost. But law enforcement sources have told me, talk about self-defense, consider taking that sort of class, walking in groups, carrying mace or pepper spray, just being aware that this is the climate that we're in, not being overly fearful. You should live your life. You should feel free to be able to do what you want to do, to go to work, to go to the store, to go to the gym, to do the things that you normally do without having too much anxiety, but also having an awareness that this is happening, that these verbal and physical attacks are real, and those numbers that we keep reporting on are likely just representing a fraction of what all is happening. So I think there is an increased awareness and allyship, and people have to take responsibility for their own actions and be accountable. And if you see something, offer support to the victim. You know, I had a friend here in New York City walking through Hell's Kitchen, where she goes all the time to mail some packages. And a guy spilled beer all over her, spit beer onto her. We're going to talk about her story on Nightly News tonight with Lester Holt. But she said 4 people witnessed it. Not one of them did anything. They laughed. That can add so much more to the trauma of the attack. Don't be one of those people. Yeah. Stand up and just ask the victim, are you okay? And can I help you report this? Even if it's not to law enforcement, maybe it's to a group like Stop AAPI Hate. But we all know we need this data because this data is what prompts action.
We absolutely have to get involved. We have to say something. Vicky, you mentioned your friend. I have a friend who told me this weekend, she's Japanese American. She is now carrying mace around with her in New York City. And she's not someone who was ever scared before. She's sassy. She's sharp. She's a New Yorker. She's aware. She does Muay Thai. She protects herself. She always says I say that wrong. I'm sorry. And she's carrying mace because she's afraid. That's where we are. And we need to be speaking up. We need to be jumping in. We need to be helping.
Unbelievable.
Vicky, thank you. It's crazy, isn't it? Thank you for your...
Yeah, we're all feeling that.
Thank you. Thank you for your reporting. Awareness is such a big part of this. And every day we have you on, I feel like we're reminding people of how important this is and helping them learn more about it. So thank you so much.
Always good to see you, Allison.
You too. All right, let's go to NBC News Now. Correspondent Simone Boyce. She's got the latest headlines from NBCnews.com. Hi, Simone.
Hey, Allison. Today we start with some news from the European Union. Its first set of sanctions on China in 30 years. EU ambassadors approved asset freezes and travel bans on 4 Chinese officials and 1 entity. Sanctions were placed for allegations of human rights abuses against China's Uyghur Muslim minority. China is the EU's second largest trading partner. And over in Minneapolis, 2 jurors were dismissed in Derek Chauvin's trial. The jurors were questioned about their knowledge of the $27 million settlement with Floyd's family. 2 admitted they could no longer be impartial. Currently, there are 7 seated jurors with opening statements set for March 29th. And a Japanese district court ruling that not allowing same-sex marriage is unconstitutional. While the win is primarily symbolic and a new law will be needed before same-sex couples can marry, activists say the ruling is revolutionary and life-changing. Japan is the only G7 nation that doesn't recognize same-sex marriage. And down south, the National Weather Service says parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama are at high risk of severe tornadoes and thunderstorms. Alabama Governor Kay Ivey declared a state of emergency ahead of the potentially dangerous weather. The storms are expected to continue overnight and into tomorrow. And you won't just be hearing and seeing songbirds this spring. Oh no, in a few weeks, billions of cicadas will emerge from their underground homes. It's called Brood X, and it only happens every 17 years. Now, cicadas are totally harmless, and researchers say we could start to see them as early as April. Allison, cicadas may be totally harmless, but have you ever seen one of these things up close? I mean, when I read this headline for the first time as I was getting ready for the show, I emitted out loud a verbal ew when I read that story because they're so nasty.
They're friendly, but they're creepy. I'm with you there, Simone, for sure.
Thanks, Allison.
See you later. Dr. Anthony Fauci and CDC Director Rochelle Walensky talking vaccine rollouts on Capitol Hill today. The nation's top disease expert giving new guidance on when kids can get vaccinated.
For high school students, it looks like they will be available to get vaccinated in the beginning of the fall, very likely for the fall term. With regard to children, we're doing an age de-escalation study in elementary school children from 12 to 9, 9 to 6, 6 to 2, and 6 months to 2 years. We anticipate we'll have enough data to be able to vaccinate these younger children by the first quarter of 2022.
NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Leanne Caldwell joining me now. Leanne, take us through some of the other major highlights from today's hearing. What else stood out to you?
Well, that was definitely one, Allison, something that parents are really wondering about as far as vaccinations for their children. There was another school component that was interesting as well, too. CDC Director Walensky said that new CDC guidelines are expected soon, saying that children in school do not have to remain 6 feet apart, but if they are masked, 3 feet apart. We know that the 6 feet requirement has been problematic for some schools reopening. Another interesting component is one member of Congress asked Dr. Fauci how they can help encourage people to get vaccinated. Dr. Fauci said that all Congress members should get vaccinated themselves, and that would be the best thing that they could do. We do know that 1 out of 4 members of Congress have not yet been vaccinated, even though they were offered it more than 2 months ago, Allison.
And congressional Democrats throwing their support behind the president's plan to raise taxes for people who make more than $400,000. It's going to be tough to get 10 Republicans to sign on to that in the Senate. So will Democrats try to pass this tax package through reconciliation like they did with COVID relief?
Well, what is probably going to happen is this idea of tax increases are related to this big infrastructure bill that Democrats and the president are talking about and want to pass. This infrastructure bill is something that Democrats are just now starting to formulate, and they know it's going to cost a lot of money. And so this is one way to pay for it. So the Democrats and the Senate are likely to release some proposals on some tax increases as early as next week, and they know full well that there is one option that remains for them, and that is, of course, budget reconciliation, which is how the COVID bill was passed, which it only means that it can be passed on a party line vote in the Senate. They have one more opportunity to do that this year, and they could very well, if they don't get Republican support, use that reconciliation package for infrastructure/tax increases, Allison.
Leanne, 40 Republican senators sent a letter to President Biden today about border wall funding. What did they say?
They say that it is unlawful that he halted funding to construct the border wall on the southern border. They say that it not only puts national security at risk, but that it is also an unlawful use of the executive branch. That is what they are arguing. Well, Democrats responded today, including the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, said that it is prudent that the administration put a halt, not stopped, but put a halt on that funding until they assess what is actually happening at the border and if the border wall in those places is actually necessary. But make no mistake about it, Allison, this political battle, which is going to take the form of a policy battle on immigration and border security, is not going away.
Leanne, the House set to vote on the Violence Against Women's Act today. It expired 2 years ago because of opposition from some Republican lawmakers. Why has it taken 2 years to vote on this again? And do you expect it to pass now?
So it actually passed the House the last Congress, but it was stuck. Same old story in the Republican-controlled Senate. The reason is because of a gun provision included in this Violence Against Women Act that would expand the restrictions of abusive partners to boyfriends, not just spouses, as far as their ability to obtain a gun. So that is a problem for many Republicans and why it did not get brought up in the Senate. It's expected to pass the House of Representatives in just a moment. But once again, the challenge is getting it in those 60 votes in the Senate, and it's unclear if it's going to be able to do that, Allison.
All right, Leanne Caldwell on Capitol Hill. Always great to see you.
You too.
If you want a shot, you can get a shot. Governor Tate Reeves tweeting that message to adults in Mississippi. The state is the second after Alaska to make vaccines available to all residents 16 and up. NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber has more from the Baptist Medical Clinic in Brandon, Mississippi.
Allison, here in Mississippi, mass vaccination sites are largely closed today because of severe weather, but inside clinics like this one, they're still vaccinating people. In Mississippi now, anyone over the age of 16 is able to get a COVID-19 vaccine if they want one. For 16 and 17-year-olds, they can get the Pfizer vaccine anyone over the age of 18, they can get any COVID vaccine available to them. We spent today meeting and talking to teenagers who are getting the vaccine or already planning to get theirs. Here's some of what they told us.
It's been really hard just to be a teenager and just be a kid. The relationship with my grandmothers, both of them, has just been strained. Time is precious with them. So just not being able to hug them or see them it's difficult. And just not being able to have a normal junior year and possibly senior year, just doing whatever I can to get that happening quicker and get things back to almost normal as soon as they can be is just something I definitely want to make happen.
I will be with my dad every single day, every single night. And so if he contracted the virus, then that means and he already has respiratory issues, then how will he, overcome the virus? So for me to be a role model and, showing that, I'm going to get the vaccine, it means that I'm teaching people that you just can't, think about yourself. You have to think about others around you.
Mississippi is the second state to open vaccine eligibility like this. Alaska did it first, but the numbers are a little bit different when you look at the two states. In Alaska, they have 18% of their population fully vaccinated. Here in Mississippi, they only have 11% of their population fully vaccinated. At a press conference yesterday, I asked the state's top health officials if they feel comfortable and confident that people who are considered high risk, be that seniors, frontline workers, or people with pre-existing conditions, that they have had enough time and access to get vaccinated prior to opening it up to everyone. And they said, yes, they feel like there is always room for improvement, but they said it is important to make sure they're getting as many people vaccinated as possible right now. And the state's health director also said, and I'm quoting here, that it's the right time to expand eligibility in Mississippi because, in his words, Mississippi has some geographic variability and availability, and we need to tap that demand where it is so that we can reach maximum impact as quickly as possible. They also say seniors 75 and up were the bulk of COVID deaths in this state, and that 60% of people living in Mississippi who are over the age of 75 have gotten at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. Allison?
At least 12% of Americans have been vaccinated as of today, and the White House says we should have enough supply for all Americans to get their COVID shots by the end of May. So what happens if we have vaccines left over once everyone gets a shot? Dr. Peter Marks from the FDA answered that question at a House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee hearing today.
There may be some concern that we have enough vaccine that if we need to give boosters in the not too distant future, that we have sufficient supply to be able to do that, because we still only know that the vaccine has a certain length of protection, probably at least 6 months, but we don't know whether that's a year or more.
NBC News senior medical correspondent Dr. John Torres joining me now. Dr. John, your thoughts here. What should America do if we have a vaccine surplus?
Well, Allison, what Dr. Marks was saying is, I think part of the solution here is if we think we have to get booster shots, especially if we have to get them in 6 months or maybe even a year's time frame, and we think they're going to work based on the variants out there, then saving them for that makes sense. On the other hand, if we think we're going to have to reformulate those booster shots, so they might be even further out, 3 to 5 years, then what we need to do is get those shots into people's arms, not necessarily in the U.S. if everybody's fully vaccinated here, or as many as we can get, but looking at the global stage and saying, are there countries that can use help? Are there countries that can use this vaccine? Because what I've mentioned many times to you, Allison, is, we could have all the vaccine, we could have all the herd immunity here we want, but if the herd immunity isn't in other places as well, it's in no place. And so we need to make sure that globally this is taken care of. Once we get through here, get through the U.S. and get people here vaccinated, then looking at other countries, if we have that excess surplus, that we can get to those to help those out, Allison.
Dr. John, today Mississippi opened its vaccine eligibility to residents 16 and older. Alaska's already doing that. Massachusetts will join them starting in April. Do you think more states should hop on that bandwagon?
And Allison, I think it depends. And it depends on what's happening in that specific state. And if they're having appointments that are going unfilled, if they're having a problem getting people to come in to get these vaccines, and they've gotten to that level where they've vaccinated all the people, essentially the low-hanging fruit that they can get vaccinated, those that are easy to get to, and they're having those open appointments, those time frames where they need to get the vaccine in people's arms, then yes, go ahead and open it up, especially in rural communities. And living here in Colorado, I've heard from a lot of people that if you go further rural, then you see more appointments that are open up. And so in those areas, it makes sense to go ahead and open up the vaccinations. It's hard to do it county by county, so you tend to do it state by state. But in some states where they're having a hard time finding vaccine slots because they're all getting filled, then you probably want to wait until those residents get it, the ones that are in phase right now, and then slowly start opening up the phases, Allison.
Dr. John, Moderna's president said this morning he doesn't see why kids would not be able to get the COVID vaccine. Here he is on the Today Show.
That we could be vaccinating adolescents going into the school year.
And have there been
the KidCo trial, 6 to 12 months old, 6 months old to 12-year-old is going to take a little bit longer. And the reason for that is you do need to be a little more cautious and progressive in working down dose levels into kids to find the right dose. Certainly haven't seen anything concerning in any of our prior work that would suggest that we can't use the vaccine in children.
In his congressional testimony today, Dr. Fauci said high school students could be vaccinated by the fall, younger kids maybe by the start of next year. What do you think of that timeline? And do you think we could see a vaccine requirement for kids when they start going back to school next year?
And Allison, that timeline has been a timeline that's been talked about for the past few months. And it looks like that's keeping on track, which is great. Getting those older students, the 12 to 17-year-old group, middle schoolers, high schoolers, vaccinated by the summertime. So when they go back to school in the fall, they have that protection. With the younger kids, is what Dr. Fauci was talking about earlier. You want to be careful and you want to drop down in a stepwise fashion in the age groups that you vaccinate, making sure it's safe and effective in the older children and then dropping down to younger and younger children. And that's why they're talking fall or winter of 2022 before they might start getting it. But as far as whether it's going to be mandated, that's going to be a bit of a hot potato because it's one of those things that you have to look at very carefully and say, you know, right now this is just authorized. It's not approved. Once it gets approved, that's going to be a different story, Allison.
Dr. John, the Biden administration announcing $10 billion to fund a school COVID testing program. What do we know about it? What might that look like?
It's going to depend on the school, the district, the community, the state. And what it's going to depend on is, number one, you know, what's the community look like? Are there outbreaks of coronavirus? Are there case numbers going up? In that case, you're going to start the testing more and more often. If, on the other hand, things are under control, you're going to do more of a surveillance testing, doing it on a periodic basis and doing sampling of students just to make sure it's not anywhere. Of course, if you have students who come down with it or teachers who come down with coronavirus, then you're going to ramp up testing for that school or possibly those pods of students. And so it's going to be very variable. And the CDC has come up with guidelines, and they're very good guidelines as far as how to start implementing that. One of the issues has been we don't have the resources to implement that, but that sounds like President Biden is doing that right now, giving them those resources, or soon too, which means they could all start ramping up these testing programs, which I think will be important as far as getting kids back to school safely, keeping the staff and the teachers safe as well, and making sure that they can stay in school, Allison.
Yeah, Dr. John, we've been talking so much about vaccinations, but testing still really important, too. Thank you for that reminder.
You bet, Allison, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
Oh, you too. President Biden and Vice President Harris both condemning the deadly Atlanta spa shootings at the White House today.
I do want to say to our Asian American community that we stand with you and understand how this has frightened and shocked and outraged. We also want to speak out in solidarity with them and acknowledge that none of us should ever be silent in the face of any form of hate.
NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba joining me now. Monica, FBI Director Christopher Wray and Attorney General Merrick Garland briefing the president on the phone today. What do you know about that conversation and how else the White House might be planning to respond here?
Well, the president, Allison, saying that he doesn't want to jump to any conclusions or make any connections about a possible motive for the shooter that is in custody. The president, of course, though, acknowledged just how jarring this has to be for the Asian American community because of how many women were dead in that incident who were of Asian descent. But he said before he wanted to make any more explicit remarks, particularly on what might have motivated this individual, that his heart went out to Asian Americans, especially because you've seen this rise in violence. This is something even that the president talked about in his primetime address to mark the 1-year anniversary of the coronavirus pandemic. So he was clear that even though the investigation continues, he was going to wait to discuss it until there is an outcome and more information on any kind of motive, but that he was going to continue to be briefed in the coming days and would have more to say once more information comes out.
All right, Monica, let's talk taxes. President Biden says he'll raise taxes on people who make more than $400,000 a year. Here he is on GMA.
Anybody making more than $400,000 will see a small to a significant tax increase. If you make less than $400,000, you won't see one single penny in additional federal tax.
But let's talk raw politics here. You didn't get a single Republican vote for tax cuts. How are you going to get a Republican vote for a tax increase?
Well, I may not get but I'll get the Democratic votes for a tax increase.
Monica, the president saying he's confident he has Democratic support, but tax increases aren't so popular with the American people. How does the administration plan to tackle that?
And this is something that candidate Joe Biden campaigned on for months. He did lay out that he would likely increase taxes on those families making more than $400,000. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to some voters who supported him that this is something that is critical, he says, in order to pay for some of the other more ambitious things he has on his agenda. But of course, you're right, Allison, this is not something that's very popular. So they're going to continue to hammer home that this will be based on income and that it can be done potentially incrementally, but there isn't a whole lot of appetite here, and there are major questions about how the president is going to be able to advance his own agenda without Republican support. And of course, then there's this other question of the filibuster and whether they're going to make any changes to that, which notably last night in this interview, the president said he is in favor of reforming it and reverting back to the old way of doing the filibuster, which is where senators have to talk to defend their position when they challenge a piece of legislation. So it's interesting there. He may be previewing at how he could get something across the finish line when it comes to these tax increases. Most likely, though, they'd be tied to another agenda item, something that's part of his Build Back Better plan. But it's unclear whether that's something like infrastructure or anything else at this point. The White House just hasn't said yet, Allison.
Monica, President Biden meeting virtually today with Ireland's prime minister to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. They also were talking about COVID. What else can you tell us about their talk and what was on their agenda?
That was a main topic of conversation. Both Ireland and the United States have committed to trying to help other countries get access to coronavirus vaccines through something called COVAX. So that's something that they discussed. And then, of course, for this president, St. Patrick's Day is very personal. His own Irish roots, he referenced that repeatedly during the meeting and said he really hopes a year from now for St. Patrick's Day, he's able to at least celebrate this in person, perhaps even with a trip to Ireland. That's something that he mentioned he would love to see. And at the White House, there are actual signs of the celebration here as well, with that fountain lit up in green and a couple of other events throughout the day. I think you can even see it behind my shoulder potentially. It's been going all day. And it's something that, again, for this administration and for this president is something of personal significance given his background and something he hopes in the years to come during his administration he can mark with a bit more flourish and celebration than at least the virtual one they're experiencing today, Allison.
Monica, that fountain was the very first thing I noticed when your shot popped up. It looks beautiful behind you. You could tell the White House is celebrating, even if in a muted way this year, for sure. The House set to vote today on the Violence Against Women Act. The 1994 law expanded domestic violence protections for women and children, but it expired over 2 years ago. NBC News correspondent Leanne Caldwell explains what's at stake today.
The Violence Against Women Act, landmark legislation first passed in 1994 after intense lobbying from women who had few legal protections and few resources against domestic and sexual violence. It's been expanded over the years to include victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. It doesn't just protect women, but all victims, including children, which Representative Debbie Dingell remembers all too well.
It's not just my story. It's the story of my siblings. And we don't forget about hiding in closets, or our father taking locks off doors, of grabbing a gun from my father so he wouldn't kill my mother.
The bill is said to have decreased domestic violence for women by 70% and 60% for men. And it's bipartisan. Pennsylvania Republican Brian Fitzpatrick is a co-sponsor.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. VAWA has been instrumental in safeguarding women and children from abuse, anguish, violence, and has resulted in the saving of millions of lives.
But it expired more than 2 years ago and wasn't able to pass again in the Republican-controlled Senate. At issue, what's known as the boyfriend loophole. Current law prevents domestic abusers from owning a gun. The current bill expands that prohibition to include not just spouses, but also dating partners. Many Republicans oppose, saying it takes away the rights to own a gun.
Democrats are using domestic violence, which is a serious issue, as a front for just their latest gun control bill. This legislation contains red flag confiscation language and expands the grounds for lifetime bans of firearm possession.
In the Senate, Iowa Republican Joni Ernst, a victim of domestic abuse, will introduce a Republican version of the bill. The House also voted on another piece of legislation pertaining to women today. It removes the congressionally mandated deadline for states to ratify what proponents hope is the 28th Amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA would enshrine protections into the Constitution based on gender, something the Constitution still does not yet do.
California Governor Gavin Newsom in one of the toughest fights of his political life. Today is the deadline for a petition to recall the governor to force a re-election. This is the sixth attempt to recall Newsom since he took office in 2019. But this time the governor says he's worried. NBC News correspondent Jake Ward has more.
Hi, Allison. That's right. Today is the day in which proponents of a recall have to turn in at least roughly 1.5 million signatures. Now, San Francisco City Hall is where Governor Newsom began his political career. And now the question is whether this could in some way be the end of it. Now, it is important to note that he has survived 6 recall efforts during just his time as governor. And there have been more than 50 efforts in the history of California. Only one of them has ever been successful, and that was the recall of Gray Davis in 2003, which of course brought Arnold Schwarzenegger into power. Now, until this point, Governor Newsom has been mostly silent on the prospect of a recall, but yesterday on The View, he had this to say about it.
Am I worried about it? Of course I'm worried about it. The nature of these things, the up or down question, the zero-sum nature of the question is challenging and it's vexing. And so, you know, we're taking it seriously. I have to do my job every single day, but I'm going to fight this thing.
Now, from here, assuming that the required number of signatures are turned in and they are then verified by county and state officials, well, that begins a domino process that could take until September before an actual recall vote could take place. That vote will consist of 2 questions on a ballot. The first is, do you want to recall the governor? And the second is, who would you want to replace him? Now, of course, it requires someone of enormous public standing, somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger, to get that kind of vote. Here in California, it takes only 12% of the people who voted for governor to recall a governor, to trigger the process we're in. But it takes more than half in order to actually do that recall. And so the prospects of this are pretty slim, is what experts say. Now, timing, of course, is everything. If you're talking here about September before a recall vote could actually take place, much less something like November or December, I mean, at that point, we could, Allison, be looking at an almost totally normal life here in California, right? The depths of summer, people vaccinated. Will the mood be the same as it is right now? Well, here's the other thing to consider is that when Gray Davis was recalled, it was mostly about wildfire-related blackouts. And September here in California is fire season. So could a new natural disaster come along, or will time be in the governor's favor? That's what we'll be watching to find out. Allison?
You have not been to a wedding till you've been to a big fat New York wedding, the state paving the way for those to come back. As of Monday, March 15th, New York is allowing weddings to max out at 150 guests, up from 50. There are a lot of rules, though. Venues are restricted to 50% capacity. Everyone has to be tested for COVID beforehand. The dancing has to be socially distanced, and guests have to wear masks unless they are eating or drinking. Let's bring in NBC News medical contributor Dr. Natalie Azar and Sandy Hammer, co-founder and chief marketing officer of All Seated. So great to have you both here. Dr. Azar, let's start with you. Weddings have been super spreader events in the past. We know a Maine wedding last August was linked to 7 deaths. What do you think of these new New York guidelines? Masks on, venues at 50% capacity, distance dancing with just your household or table. Does that reduce the risk enough? Do you think this is safe?
You know, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, Allison, with the question of, is this enough? Because it's not really just going to be one or two things that I think will make a difference here, but really the sum total of all of these efforts. And look, you know, a lot of things on the list make a lot of sense. The testing, certainly I prefer that, you know, as opposed to no testing. But remember, testing isn't foolproof. You require a negative test 72 hours before before the event. So, you know, what happens in those 3 days before you get to the actual venue? You know, I think in between if you read in between the lines, there's a lot of other things that they're recommending too, like masks on the staff, partitions at the food stations, signing in so that they can do contact tracing. But here is the number one thing that I think is going to be the stumbling block, and that is alcohol. We know that when people start to drink, they're going to lose that vigilance over their behavior. And look, I have friends and I have, you know, patients who've postponed their wedding 1, 2, 3 times, and I get that people want to do this, but you look at this list and you go, I'm not really sure it's worth it. Does it even really sound like that much fun? Is it safe? Lots of things to consider, Allison.
Yeah, and Dr. Azar, you said it. We all have that close talking aunt or uncle or cousin or family member who has a couple of drinks and just can't maintain that necessary distance. It's definitely going to be a challenge. All right, it's tough. Sandy, let me ask you, some of New York's most famous wedding venues use All Seated. I'm talking the Plaza, Cipriani, the Rainbow Room. How are you helping these venues adjust to these new and somewhat restrictive guidelines?
So thanks, Allison, for having us. And I have to say that I had actually 2 weddings, 2 children married this year in Corona. So I have a lot of, I've done it all. So it's been an experience.
For sure.
You know, the pandemic happened and everything was closed, and you know, the hospitality industry was shut down. All the venues were shut down. So what we decided to do was to build some tools that were going to really help them. And we're a tech company, so we immediately got our coders out and we developed an easy distancing tool that allows for the planners and the events to set the distance while maximizing the space. And that's really what the venues have to do. They have to understand how they can actually use the space. That's exactly what you've got in front of you. So this tool actually calculates in real time. It calculates all the distances exactly like you're showing between all the tables and all the chairs, alleviating the stress, okay? Because this is a stressful time. And the planners have to make sure that the floor plan meets the guidelines for that city, right? So, for example, let's talk about New York. In New York, we've got the regulation and we know it's 6 feet. And it actually will appear red if any of the chairs or the table or the couches, anything touches within that 6 feet. Now, once the red disappears from the floor plan, you know that the seating arrangement's safe. Plus, we added all the safety objects like the sanitary stations, the null zones, air walls, stickers for the floor. It's kind of like a game, this program, where you move and rotate and chair positioning until you actually see no red. And then that gives everyone the confidence to start running the event. But a lot of the venues are being very careful. They're using a lot more outdoor spaces. They use spreading things out as much as they can to really give as much distance. But it's tough. It's not easy.
Sandy, this is really cool, and you describe it so well because it does look like a game. I would have an endless field day trying to plan people's events and weddings. I would enjoy it so much. Let me ask, though, what are some of the biggest challenges you've seen with these venues? I mean, I, for one, have no idea how you enforce socially distanced dancing, even if you have all of the right things in place. What else is making it tough for some of these places to pull parties and events off, even if they do all of the smart things and use programs like yours? What's the feedback you're getting about what they're finding the most difficult?
I think we mentioned it. It's the dancing that's really the hardest part. Some of the venues are just not allowing it. They're just, they're having the music at the beginning. They're really trying to keep distances. Some of them are moving it to outdoors. Outdoors is much safer than indoors. And a lot of the venues are just being very cautious to allow the capacity. So if the plaza or any of these very big spaces can actually have 500 people, and they can then only now have what the guidelines are, 150 people, then that's within the guidelines, right? They're feeling that that's got a safety, but they're struggling. I think our tools are giving them the visual ability, which once you've got that visual ability, then you feel a little bit more confident, your clients feel confident, and that's helping a little bit. But a lot of the venues are really putting in those guidelines with a lot of spacing. They're making sure the bars are distances. They're making sure that the catering tables and the facilities have got a lot of distancing between them. Some of them are doing, set boxes so that you don't have to do too much touching. A lot of it is really thought out. There's a lot of planning behind the scenes, a tremendous amount of planning.
It's so impressive. Sandy, thank you so much. Dr. Azar, thank you for your advice. The reminder as well that when alcohol is involved, things can get a little bit complicated. Great to have you both on. Hope we're all able to dance at a wedding soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Alice.